Thank you for joining our webinar on real-world data challenges and considerations. My name is Wendy Young, and I'm a content strategist here at Certara, and I am so excited to be a part of the team bringing you this webinar today. Today we have with us Jeff Abolafia, Director of Product Innovation at Certara. Jeff is an innovative life science professional with over 35 years of experience in data standards, statistical computing, and data management in both academic and non-academic clinical research environments. He is recognized consistently for leadership in clinical research, regulatory submission strategy, end-to-end standards implementation, team building, and innovative process improvements. Jeff joined our team here at Pinnacle 21 back in the summer of 2020. Jeff?
Thank you, Wendy, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about some of the challenges facing sponsors when submitting real-world data, and we're going to provide some recommendations that we hope will facilitate regulatory review. This is our agenda for today. First, we'll provide a brief introduction, then we'll give some background on real-world data, and we'll outline some of the challenges facing sponsors when submitting real-world data. Fourth, we'll provide some recommendations for sponsors for submitting real-world data, and finally, we'll wrap it up with some conclusions, both short-term and long-term. First, an introduction to real-world data. So today, due to changes in technology, more health-related data are available from a wide variety of sources and a wide variety of study designs that weren't available in the past. The good news is all this additional data can provide a lot more evidence about the benefits or risks of a medical product. Furthermore, there's been a sharp increase in NDAs and BLAs that include non-randomized clinical trial study designs. And moving forward, I'll refer to these study designs as RCTs. These BLAs and NDAs include electronic health records, registry, and other observational studies. CDIS standards, the standards we now are submitting clinical data in, were developed about 20 years ago, and they were developed to support marketing applications. However, they were primarily developed and optimized to support RCT study designs. These data currently are submitted in SAS version 5 transport, and this format was developed about in 1999, so we have a submission format that's about 25 years old. As a result of using standards in a format that were developed over 20 years ago, submission of non-RCT studies has presented numerous challenges to both sponsors and to FDA. So what is real-world data? What is real-world evidence? The FDA's framework for the real-world evidence program defines real-world data as data relating to patient health status and or delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. Real-world evidence is the clinical evidence that we generate, and it's evidence about the use and potential benefits and risk of a medical product derived from the analysis of real-world data. So these are the official definitions for this presentation. We'll go with the working definition of real-world data is data generated from clinical data that isn't generated from a protocol. Where does real-world data come from? Real-world data can come from a variety of sources. Come from electronic health records, come from medical claims and billing data, product disease and population-based registries, mobile devices, digital health technology devices such as CGM or actigraphy. You can get real-world data from social media sources. The focus of this presentation is going to be on electronic health records and digital health technology devices. Why is real-world evidence important for us today? Well, 95% of approved NDAs and BLAs in 2021 included a real-world evidence study compared to 75% in 2019. And there's no evidence this trend is decreasing given trends in the regulatory environment. We expect that almost all studies will continue to include a real world evidence study in an NDA or a BLA. So over time, the clinical data that we submit in a marketing application has gone from a collection of RCTs to RCTs plus maybe some studies with data from electronic health records, perhaps data from claims. Maybe we have some data from observational studies and perhaps even some data from registry studies. So you can see the data we submit to support a marketing application has changed a great deal over time. Okay, now let's look at some more background information on real-world data. So what are the current submission standards for real-world data? Well, in October of 2021, the FDA issued a draft guidance, which was finalized in December of 2023. The title of the guidance is Data Standards for Drug and Biological Product Submissions Containing Real-World Data Guidance for Industry. Essentially, this guidance outlined the standards that are required when submitting real-world data and other non-interventional data in support of a marketing application. So according to the guidance, real-world data must be submitted using the standards documented in the FDA Data Standards Catalog. That means, for now, real-world data must be submitted using CDISC standards. I think that's worth repeating. CDISC is required for all real-world data studies, as well as, of course, RCT studies. That means data from real-world studies must be transformed or converted to meet CDISC format and CDISC standards. In the guidance, the agency also acknowledges that the current catalog standards might not necessarily reflect data derived from real-world studies and other non-interventional study designs. And it's considering some updates to what's in the current catalog. This presents numerous challenges to sponsors as CDISC studies were designed for RCT data. Next, let's take a look at some of the challenges for submitting RWD. So in this chart here, we outline some of the challenges for submitting RWD compared to randomized clinical trials. I think it's fair to say that most of these challenges stem from the fact that real data isn't collected under a protocol, it's not cleaned, it's not monitored, and there's no uniformity across sites in what we might expect from real-world data. Unlike RCTs, which are collected under a strict supervision of a protocol, they're monitored, they're clean, and there's an expectation of uniformity for the data collected across sites. Let's drill down a little now into some of these specific challenges. So the biggest challenge, of course, is real-world data is by definition not collected under a protocol. So it's not collected to address a specific research question. It's just collected under routine healthcare. On the other hand, RCTs are collected under a protocol where the protocol provides a blueprint, if you will, for how a research study is to be conducted. It documents when each assessment is conducted, where each assessment is conducted, and how each assessment is conducted. And along with the protocol, RCTs typically include a data management plan that provides the granular details for collecting RCT data. It includes a copy of an annotated CRF. It includes a description of all the data elements and their attributes, as well as edit checks for each data element and a data monitoring and data cleaning plan. On the other hand, real-world data is collected in a real-world setting and contains none of the above documentation. That means it's not monitored and it's not clean. It is real-world data is what it is. The second, I think, challenge is what I'll call data source data provenance. RCT data comes from systems designed by the sponsor, and it's collected by the sponsor or an agent of the sponsor, all under supervision by the sponsor. Sponsors have control over the entire process, from designing the data collection system to transforming the data into CDISC standards and to submitting, and eventually to submitting the data. Most real-world data is not collected by the sponsor. It's collected in real-world settings during routine healthcare, and it's collected in a variety of healthcare settings by a variety of clinical staff. Second, most real-world data is acquired by the sponsor from vendors. The data is curated by vendors, and this presents some challenges for documenting how the data traveled from source to submission. Another challenge here is sponsors must be able to submit patient-level data. This is not an issue for RCTs because sponsors have control of the data from the beginning to end of a clinical study. This may be an issue for real-world data because the vendor may only have aggregate data and might not be able to provide patient-level data. Another challenge is what I'll call data uniformity. Remember, randomized clinical trials data is collected uniformly across sites. It's collected with standard CRF elements, and it's collected by site personnel who are trained to conduct an assessment in a uniform manner and to enter data in a uniform manner. Furthermore, all this data is entered into a single EDC or other data collection system that's controlled by the sponsor. In contrast, for real-world data, there's no expectation really that the data is uniform or standardized across healthcare systems. As they say, if you've seen one EHR system, you've seen one EHR system. Next challenge is what I'll call terminology. Clinical research and healthcare terminology lack harmonization. They use different concepts to refer to the same thing. Many of similar concepts have different meanings and different control terminology. On the other hand, RCTs use the same terminology and same coding systems for all sites and for all studies. So RCTs and RWU use different terminology. For example, RCTs use MEDRA and WHO to code adverse events in medication, where RWD tend to use ICD and SNOMED, but that might not even be the case for all healthcare EHRs. So terminology from rural data studies must be recoded to meet submission required terminology. And current submission standards, that being CDISC, do not contain standard elements to represent both the source and the submission terminology or coding system. This could make source data verification and traceability a challenge for regulatory reviewers. If you'd like to learn more about challenges for submitting non-RCT data, here are 4 papers I've written with a couple of my colleagues from IBM, and these papers are available for your viewing. So the next challenge I want to talk about is the gap in the current submission standards, that being CDISC. So first major gap, I think, is traceability. For randomized clinical trials, of course, we have the protocol, we have the study documentation, we have annotated CRFs, we have a defined file that could provide traceability for regulatory reviewers. For RWD, it's not clear yet what traceability is going to be required by regulatory reviewers, but we know that some traceability back to the source is needed, some kind of annotated document describing the source. And I think for now, this has been a challenge for reviewers as these standards haven't been established. The next gap we want to talk about is the data elements and domains. So currently, CDISC is required, and both the domains and the elements contained in those domains were primarily designed for RCT study design. When submitting RWD, there's a need for additional concepts found in RWD, not found in randomized clinical trials, and there's also a gap in the domains that currently exist. Again, were created to accommodate randomized clinical trial data, not RWD. Furthermore, many of the data elements currently existing in CDISC really aren't relevant for RWD. The next gap we could talk about is exposure. Exposure is some of the most key data required for a marketing application in a clinical study. For RCTs, exposure study drug is documented in the protocol and is well defined. And the collection of this data, again, is designed and controlled by the sponsor. For RWD, the data for exposure exists all over the place. There's prescription data, there's refill data, there's dispense data, there's data about what medications administered in a healthcare provider setting. There's medication statements, that is, medications patients say they take. So I think we need to determine what variables are needed and what are the core variables to derive exposure, and to determine the quality and the certainty of each of these records, because all these records are not equal. Next is the trial summary set data set. This data set is required for a regulatory submission. It needed, or else you could fail the rejection criteria. So for real world studies, I think we need to define the parameters. We need to define new parameters related to real world evidence studies. Some of these parameters overlap, but with RCTs, but not all of them. So this is an area, again, where we need to define parameters that are relevant for RWE studies. Next gap is what I call core variables. CDISC has defined core variables for RCT study designs. We have not really defined what a set of core variables for real world evidence studies. I think this is a vital need that needs to be done sooner than later. And the final gap is terminology. We've talked about this a little bit. RCTs and RWD designs contain different terminology, which needs to be harmonized for a marketing application. Okay, next we're going to provide some recommendations which we hope will facilitate regulatory review. So these recommendations come from previous real world evidence submission. By looking at some of the RWE data that's been submitted, we could learn a lot, especially from studies that the FDA has judged as inadequate for regulatory decision making. And these recommendations, we hope, could be used to avoid common mistakes that can result in a real world evidence study being rejected or not considered. And ultimately, hopefully, these recommendations could be used to avoid delays in regulatory review of marketing applications containing real world data. So our first recommendation, and one of the most important recommendations, is early communication with both FDA and vendors. Let's talk about the FDA first. So the challenge here, of course, is real world data is not collected under a protocol, and it's not collected to address a specific research question. So it's important to communicate, with the FDA and assure them that the real world data is fit for purpose and it's non-biased, and it appropriately addresses whatever the research question is at hand, and the population that's being selected in the real world data is appropriate to address the study question. I think the other challenge, of course, is showing that the data is of high quality and being able to document the data provenance / data lineage. And furthermore, this data tends to contain a lot of missing data. So I think we early on need to convey this information to the FDA. How much data is missing? Is the missing data random or is it biased? How much missing data is there for key variables and key covariates? So the recommendation here is pretty straightforward. I think as early as possible, it's a good idea to notify the FDA that your submission will include real world data and that you should submit whatever study plans, statistical analysis plans to the FDA and get as much feedback as possible before starting a study on, is your real world data fit for use? Is your study design adequate? Is your rationale for choosing the data source that you did okay? Can your data source address the study questions at hand? And of course, is the data reviewable? So in addition to communicating early with the FDA, it's also a good idea to communicate early with vendors. Bottom line is, make sure you know what you're buying, and as much as possible, vet the data before purchasing it. And some things you might want to consider are, will the patient level data, of course, be available to you for submission? What's the sample size going to be after exclusions? Is the data for all the key variables and covariates available? Do you have adequate information on data provenance and traceability to include in your marketing application? The next issue is determining the study start date in real world data. So in order to pass the FDA's technical rejection criteria, you must submit a valid TS domain with the study start date. So it's pretty straightforward for a randomized clinical trial. It's typically going to be the date the first patient signed informed consent or the first patient first visit. With real world data, this is a little complex. If you're using historical data, perhaps it was collected 5 years ago, maybe it was collected 10 years ago. So what should the study start date be for a retrospective real world data study? So I think our recommendation here again is pretty straightforward. Given that the criteria and given the criteria for RCT doesn't really apply to real world data study, we recommend using what we'll call an administrative start date for real world data studies. That's going to be determined by the sponsor. This will typically be when the inclusion/exclusion criteria are finalized, or perhaps the date that the RWD study protocol is finalized. It's worth noting this recommendation is aligned with the current guidance for non-clinical studies in the technical conformance guide. In any event, it's a good idea to discuss this with the FDA and get their buy-in. Next, we're going to talk about the issue of data confidence. So remember, real world data is collected in real world settings. It's not monitored. It's not clean. There's some questions sometimes about data provenance, data lineage. So we like regulatory reviewers to have confidence in the quality of the data we've submitted. So we think it's a good idea in a lot of cases to provide multiple sources for the same data to provide additional confidence for regulatory reviewers. So the challenge here is for randomized clinical trials. Of course, the protocol specifies who, how, and where assessments are performed in great detail. So there's really not a need to capture most of this type of data during data collection. Furthermore, RCT data is cleaned and monitored as documented in the protocol. On the other hand, for RWD, data is not collected under a protocol and it's not monitored. As a result, regulatory reviewers would like more information about what I'll call the context of an assessment, right? How it's performed, who it's performed, where it's performed. This will help increase their confidence in the data. And it's my opinion that FDA would also like multiple sources to increase their confidence in the real world data. So let's look at an example, an exposure example, given that exposure is one of the most key pieces of data that we collect. The challenge for real world data is exposure data is collected in a variety of places and with a variety degrees of confidence, right? So we have one type of data, which is medication request or a prescription. That just means it was prescribed. It doesn't mean it doesn't prove that the medication or treatment was taken. Then we have medication dispensed. That just shows the medication was dispensed. And that type of data may or may not even be in a health record. We have a medication statement type data. This is basically what the patient said they took. And finally, we have medication administration data. This is data where the medication is actually administered in a healthcare setting. And this is probably the type of data we have the most confidence in. So for real world data, we may have data from one of these sources. We may have data from several of these sources. So the challenges, of course, is to accurately construct exposure to a given treatment from whatever sources are available. So what's our recommendation here? Well, the source data is not very different than data collected under a protocol. So we recommend in what I would call submitting it in as SDTM as possible, and submitting the data from as many sources as possible where the data exists. You're likely going to wind up creating custom domains or a lot of supplementary variables. Most importantly, document the source of each record type. So we're recommending here's create a new variable called source that says, where did this data come from? Is it a medication statement record? Is it a medication administration record, dispense record, refill record, etc. Whatever you have, submit it, even if it doesn't fit in the SDTM structure very well. Then in Atom, take all of the data that you have available and construct the exposure for each patient. And this will the way you construct exposure for each patient will differ, of course, by study in protocol, and it should be clearly documented in the SAP. Furthermore, if possible, if you could verify some of this data with an alternative source like claims data, this will provide an extra level of confidence for regulatory reviewers. And of course, you should provide detailed traceability for how you constructed exposure data from the source data in both the defined file and in the reviewer's guides. Another example of using multiple sources for confirmation is patient death data, of course, which is key for many protocols. So the challenge is death data from real world, from the death data from a real world data source may not even be captured for patients. For example, if the patient didn't die in the hospital where the health record exists, it might not be captured in the health record. even if the patient did die in that healthcare settings, there may or may not be a valid date of death and a valid cause or death. These data elements, of course, being key data elements for safety data. So the problem is here: how can we construct death data and provide confidence to regulatory reviewers about the quality of this type of data? So our recommendation is again to use multiple data sources. And so if you have questionable or missing death data in the health record, consider aggregating some additional death data, maybe from the state death records or the National Death Index or the Social Security Death Index, and include the data as with exposure data. Submit the data from every source that exists for your death data. Furthermore, as recommended by the PCORNet Common Data Model, you could derive some confidence variables. So you could provide for each source record what you think your level of confidence is in the accuracy of the date of death or the cause of death. We believe this strategy will also provide regulatory reviewers with additional confidence in this type of data. Next challenge I kind of want to talk about is what we've talked about a little bit already, is differences in terminology. Clinical research and healthcare terminology lack harmonization. Concepts have different names, have different meanings, and different control terminology. For RCTs, of course, they use the same terminology and coding system for all sites and for all studies. They use MEDRA and WHO to code adverse events and medications. On the other hand, real-world data tends to use ICD and SNOMED, but that might not even be the case for all healthcare EHRs. As a result, terminology for real-world data must be recoded to meet submission-required terminology. One of the biggest issues here is the current submission standards, that being CDIS, do not contain standard data elements to represent both the source and submission terminology or coding systems, and this makes source data verification and traceability a big challenge for regulatory reviewers. So what is our recommendation here? Again, we recommend creating new supplemental variables in SDTM to capture the source coding system, the source verbatim term, and the source code. Second, we recommend providing an explanation of the process to convert the source terminology to submission compliant terminology. So an example of this kind of transformation might be we're going to convert data captured in SNOMED or ICD to MEDRA as required by FDA for adverse events. One of the greatest challenges for regulatory reviewers is understanding the traceability in real-world data from source to submission, in that many of the RWD databases and documentation submitted to FDA today are really inadequate for regulatory decision-making because they don't include the required documentation and traceability. So it's worth noting that you must provide the same level of documentation and traceability for real-world data as for RCT study designs. If not, you're likely to experience delays in regulatory review of marketing applications, and because you're likely to get an IR requesting additional documentation and additional information about traceability. So what are our recommendations here? Again, I think sponsors should plan on discussing their submission of real-world data as early as possible for FDA. We think it's also worthwhile coming up with a data management plan that you could discuss with regulatory reviewers. You should provide documentation on your approach for transforming source data to the CDIS standard, and you could describe this. You could describe your approach in a protocol or a data management or plan or and additionally in a final study report. This documentation should include a data dictionary that documents the definition of every data element used, any other relevant information about these data elements, such as relationship to other data, origin, usage, format. The reviewer's guide is a great place to describe your overall approach, while the find file, of course, is the place to provide the technical details of how you map source data to submission format. Again, it's worth repeating. The bar for traceability for real-world data is the same as for randomized clinical data. This is something to keep in mind as you're preparing a submission containing real-world data. Another idea is, in addition to creating a data management plan for real-world data, create an annotated CRF for the real-world data you're going to submit. It could help reviewers understand the meaning of a given concept and show how various data elements are related to one another. And it could also be used to show the original and possible values of a data element. Next, let's turn to some long-term considerations and solutions. So again, our challenge here is current submission standards are inadequate for representing real-world data. Because, remember, CDISC standards were developed for randomized clinical trials or interventional studies. And our current standards are built on older technologies such as SAS transport. These standards also lack many concepts related to real-world data, and we've yet to identify what are the core variables needed for a real-world data submission. Many of the business and validation rules for randomized clinical trials just do not apply to real-world data. Furthermore, real-world data has to be repackaged and transformed to meet regulatory and submission guidelines. And real-world data is, I would say, more complex than randomized clinical data. As a result, I think we need better data linking solutions, because the current data solution, the way we link data internally and externally, are both cumbersome and outdated. So one of my recommendations here is, so how do we deal with the gap in standards, is I think our industry needs to re-examine the current submission standards, that, again, those being CDISC. We need to ask some new questions, like, could CDISC standards adequately represent randomized clinical trial plus real-world data plus observational study designs? Or maybe should we have a more hybrid approach for collected data, where each type of data is represented in a standard for which it is optimized? For example, perhaps we can submit for source data, RCT data using CDISC standards, maybe EHR and claims data using the FHIR standard, and perhaps other observational and registry standard studies using the OMOP standard. Another question we should ask, should we use a more modern standard like FHIR perhaps for all studies? Why not, since there's a trend towards submitting more RWD studies and marketing applications, and it looks like there's also a trend that a lot of especially healthcare and claims data will be represented in FHIR. I think it's worth asking the question, will most RCT study data be collected via an EHR in the future? If so, that perhaps makes a case for FHIR to be considered as a future standard. Another question I think worth asking is, will standards such as CDISC, FHIR, and OMOP all be harmonized in the future? If so, that might make a case for a more hybrid type submission. Okay, let's go to some conclusions and wrap this up. So, submitting real-world data presents a number of challenges, both for sponsors and for the FDA. This is because there are significant gaps in the current standards for submitting real-world data, as these standards were designed for RCTs. However, the bar or the bar for assessing real-world data is the same as for data from randomized clinical study designs. Next, we need better documentation on data provenance and source data elements to facilitate regulatory review. However, I feel that our future cannot really be complex transformations. This is unnecessarily burden on the sponsor and is likely to produce numerous errors. I think we need to take a step back in this area and think, are we asking the right question to solve these challenges? The question we should be asking isn't how can we squeeze CDISC or squeeze RWD into CDISC standards. Maybe it's time to reevaluate whether we can use CDISC as a single submission standard for all study designs. Finally, my favorite two recommendations: document, 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 and communicate early and often with FDA. Okay, next we're going to turn to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Okay, see from the chat we have several questions. So I'll let's see, to this first question, which is, has CDISC taken any steps to accommodate real-world data? And let's see, until lately, I would have said no. However, in February of 2024, CDISC did finalize a document called Considerations for SDTM Implementation and Observational Studies and Real-World Data. I guess in this document, CDISC does outline some of the challenges using CDISC to represent real-world data, and those are most of the same challenges we discussed, and they have some partial solutions to some of these problems. I think this document's a good start for identifying some of the problems, but I think a lot more has to be done in this area, as this document is pretty, I would call it, incomplete, but a good start. Okay, next question in the chat. Let's see. Do you think rural data and possibly randomized clinical trial data will be submitted in another standard in the future? Well, let's see. Maybe we could break this down in the short term and long term. So in the short term, at least for the next 5, maybe even longer number of years, I think CDISC will continue to remain the standard. And I think the FDA has invested heavily in CDISC. Their tools, their documentation, their processes are all assumed CDISC standards. I think that's also true for sponsors. Sponsors have built end-to-end systems, processes, and tools and documentation. So I think both FDA and sponsors are somewhat invested in CDISC in the short term. In the long term, I'm not really so sure. I think it depends on perhaps what modifications CDISC makes. Will FHIR maybe emerge as a standard? Will FHIR become more of an exchange standard and perhaps come up with the data elements and packaging solutions so it could become a long-term submission standard? It's also possible in the long term, which is that will go to a more hybrid solution. That is, each type of data will be submitted using the standard for which it's optimized by. There's numerous efforts right now to harmonize CDISC and OMOP and FHIR, so it could be a hybrid approach, is one that makes sense in the future. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, is there one key thing sponsors could do to facilitate regulatory review of real-world data? Let's see, if I had to pick one for right now, again, would say document, document, document. Provide as much documentation on data provenance and traceability of data from source to submission. I guess I could throw in a second one that's related: communicate often and early with FDA.
Okay, we've run a little bit over time, so that is all of the time that we have for questions. Thank you so much to Jeff for an information-packed presentation, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you put a question in the chat and we didn't get to it, rest assured we will address it either in our follow-up blog post or, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, your customer success manager may reach out to you to answer any kind of organization-specific question if you asked one in the chat, if you are a P21E customer. Thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.